Chapter 16. The Shore. They drove until the snow ran out. It happened gradually, the white ground thinning, patching, giving way to brown earth and then green. The mountains descended into rolling hills, and the hills descended into coastal lowlands, and by the time the sun came up, they were in country that looked almost normal. Fields, trees, a road that was mostly intact. The truck's heater had died somewhere around midnight, and the cold had settled into Finch's bones like a tenant that refused to leave, but the sight of green, actual green, not the white of snow or the gray of stone, made something in her chest loosen. Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel and the other on his knee, and he hadn't said much since they left the compound. His forearm was bruised where the tyrant had struck him, a deep purple bloom that Finch could see every time he shifted gears. His face had the gray, drawn look of someone running on adrenaline that was about to run out. The blood on Finch's hands had dried hours ago, cracking at the knuckles like old paint, and she hadn't been able to bring herself to wipe it off. Every time she looked at it, she saw the tyrant's face, the moment the knife went in, the way the silver eyes had gone empty. "Where are we heading?" she asked. "The coast, west of Sydney. Cameron said the farm was out here somewhere." Out here was a large territory. The coast west of Sydney stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a jagged line of cliffs and beaches and estuaries that Finch had never seen in any version of reality. But Caleb had a direction, southwest, following the road, and Finch trusted him, and the truck had fuel, and that was enough for now. They passed through towns that had been abandoned so long the trees had started reclaiming the streets. A servo with its sign still hanging, the letters faded to ghosts. A pub with its doors open to the weather, the bar stools covered in bird droppings. A school with a playground that had become a small forest, saplings pushing through the soft fall surface like fingers through skin. Finch watched it all go by and tried not to think, but thinking was what she did best, and the thoughts came anyway, uninvited and relentless. She thought about the tyrant's face, the way she'd smiled when she talked about violence, the way her voice had softened when she mentioned Mara, the way her silver eyes, Finch's eyes, her own eyes, had looked in the moment before Finch drove the knife home. I killed her, Finch thought. I killed a version of myself. I killed the worst thing I could have become, and I did it because I had to, and I'd do it again, and I hate that I'd do it again. The road curved along the coastline. To their left, the land fell away in steep cliffs to the ocean. To their right, it rose in forested hills. The sky was overcast but bright, the kind of winter light that makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly too clean, as though someone had turned up the contrast on the world. They found the coast by lunchtime. The road crested a hill and the ocean appeared, vast and gray and endless, the waves rolling in with the patient persistence of something that had been doing this for billions of years and would continue long after humans and their viruses and their parallel worlds were gone. Finch had never seen the ocean in this direction. In Sydney, the coast ran north-south, and the Pacific was always to the east. But here it was, to the southwest, the same ocean, but a different view, the same water seen from a different angle. Caleb pulled the truck over at a lookout point, a gravel pull-off with a rusted railing and a bench that had been bolted to the ground and then ripped free by weather or time. They got out and stood at the railing and looked at the ocean. The wind blew, the waves broke, the sky was overcast but bright, and the air smelled like salt and kelp and the deep, clean scent of a world that was still, despite everything, beautiful. "I'm sorry," Finch said. Caleb looked at her. "For what?" "For back there, in the compound. I didn't mean to. I mean, I had to, but I know. She was me. She was a version of you that got broken, and she was going to kill us. You saved our lives, Finch. You saved mine." Finch looked at her hands. The blood was still there, cracking and flaking. "I know, but that doesn't make it—" "No, it doesn't." Caleb put his hand on her shoulder. "But it makes it necessary. And necessary is sometimes the best we get." They stood at the railing for a long time, watching the ocean. The waves came in sets of 3, The first wave large and powerful, the second smaller, the third barely a ripple. Over and over and over, the same pattern, the same rhythm, the same ancient conversation between water and stone. They drove along the coast for another hour, looking for the settlement Cameron had described. They passed through abandoned towns and wild farmland and empty stretches of road. Once they saw a hollow, standing in the middle of a field, motionless, staring at nothing. Caleb slowed the truck and they watched it through the window. It was a man, or had been. His clothes were faded and torn. His skin was the color of wet cement. His mouth hung open, and from it came a low, continuous groan that was almost musical, like a note played on a broken instrument. They drove on. The hollow didn't follow. They were already ghosts to it, already forgotten, already part of the background noise of a world that had moved on from the business of being human. And then, just as Caleb was starting to suggest they turn back and try a different approach, they saw it. A sign, hand-painted, nailed to a fence post at the edge of a property, Safe Harbor Farm. Welcome, you are not alone. Below the words, a phone number that would never ring again. Below that, an arrow pointing down a long driveway. Caleb looked at Finch. Finch looked at Caleb. "We go in?" he asked. "We go in." The driveway was long and straight, lined with trees that had been planted deliberately and maintained with care. They were fruit trees, apples by the look of them, though it was the wrong season to tell, and they formed a canopy overhead that filtered the gray light into something softer, something almost gentle. The property beyond was surprising. After the devastation they had seen everywhere else, this place was an anomaly. Fields had been plowed and planted in neat rows. Fences were intact, the wire taut, the posts straight. A barn stood at the center of the property, its red paint faded but not gone, its roof solid and whole, the kind of barn that had been built to last and had done exactly that. And people, living, working people, moving through the fields and the buildings with the unhurried purpose of people who had found a rhythm and were sticking to it. Finch counted 7, maybe 8, scattered across the property. One was mending a fence, another was carrying a bucket toward what looked like a chicken coop. A third was sitting on the porch of a farmhouse whittling something from a piece of wood. A woman met them at the end of the driveway. She was perhaps 50, with sun-weathered skin and gray-streaked hair tied back in a bandana. She wore work clothes, boots, jeans, a flannel shirt, and she carried a tool that might have been a hoe and might have been a weapon. Her eyes were the color of old tea, and they missed nothing. "New arrivals?" she asked. "Yes," Caleb said. "We're looking for shelter, we were told." "By who?" "By a man named Cameron, in Bathurst." The woman's expression softened. It was subtle, a slight relaxation of the jaw, a gentling of the eyes. But Finch saw it because she was learning to read faces, all the time, in every version of reality. "Cameron, I know him. He's a good kid. Comes through sometimes, trades supplies. He told us to watch for people heading west." She extended a hand. "Helen." Caleb shook it. "Caleb, this is my daughter, Finch." Helen looked at Finch. She looked at the lavender hair and the too large jacket and the blood-cracked hands and the kitchen knife at her belt, and she didn't flinch. "Come on, then. Park the truck. I'll get you some food and we can talk." The farmhouse was a weatherboard structure, old but well-maintained, with a wide veranda and a front door that opened directly into a kitchen. The kitchen was warm. There was a wood stove in the corner, burning steadily, and the smell of something cooking, a stew maybe or a soup, filled the room with a richness that made Finch's stomach clench with hunger. Helen served them tea, real tea from actual tea bags, which Finch stared at as though it were gold dust, and bread, fresh baked, with butter, and the stew, which turned out to be a root vegetable medley with dried meat, hearty and warming, and the best thing Finch had tasted since the porridge at the junkyard months ago. "There are about 20 of us here at any given time," Helen said, settling into a chair across the table. "People come and go. Some stay for a few weeks, some for a few months, some Well, some stay. We've been running this place since the outbreak. Started with 5 people and a prayer. Now we've got fields and fences and enough food to last the winter. Hollows? Caleb asked. We get them occasionally. A few wander in from the bush. We deal with them. We've got walls, not big ones, just enough to slow them down. And we've got weapons, and we've got a community that works. The trick is not being worth the trouble. We stay quiet, we stay hidden, we don't go looking for trouble. And the black vultures? Avarice? Helen's face darkened at the name Avarice, but she shook her head. They've never found us. We're too far off the main roads, too isolated. The vultures have their territory, Avarice has theirs, and we've got ours. As long as we don't attract attention, we're safe. She showed them to their room, a proper room in the farmhouse, with a bed, a window that looked out over the fields, and a door that locked. The sheets were clean, the pillow was soft. There was a candle on the nightstand and a box of matches beside it. Finch sat on the edge of the bed and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not since Brookvale. Not since the last morning in her bedroom, the morning before everything changed. Safe. She felt safe. Caleb sat beside her. The mattress dipped under his weight. He looked around the room, at the clean sheets, the solid walls, the window with its view of green fields, and his face did something Finch hadn't seen it do in a long time. It relaxed. Not completely, not all at once, but in stages, like a fist unclenching. We're going to be okay, he said. You don't know that. No, but I'm going to believe it anyway, because if I don't, then what's the point? Finch leaned against him. He put his arm around her, and for a while they just sat there, in a room on a farm on the coast of a world that wasn't their own, and they were alive, and they were together, and that was enough. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was something, and something was all they had. Chapter 17. Quiet Days. The days on the farm were quiet, not the empty, dangerous quiet of the world outside, the quiet of safety, of routine, of people who had chosen to build something rather than just survive. Finch woke early, helped in the fields, ate meals with the community, and went to bed tired in a way that was satisfying rather than terrifying. The mornings had a rhythm to them, a cadence that Finch learned to feel in her bones the way she had once felt the rhythm of the train to school in another life, on another Earth. She woke to the sound of Helen's boots on the porch boards, a heavy, deliberate tread that carried through the floorboards and up into the walls, and to the smell of wood smoke drifting from the kitchen chimney. She dressed in the gray pre-dawn light, lacing her boots by the window, watching the sky lighten in stages. First a pale wash along the eastern ridge, then a slow seep of color that turned the clouds from charcoal to pearl. By the time she stepped outside, the air was cool and damp and smelled of eucalyptus and wet earth, and the first birdsong was beginning to thread through the silence. She walked to the fields with Helen, or sometimes alone, depending on the day. The path wound between the vegetable beds and the chicken enclosure, a sturdy structure of wire mesh and timber that housed 6 hens and a rooster named Captain, who crowed at inappropriate hours and had once chased Lily across the yard with his wings out. The chickens scattered at Finch's approach, clucking and bobbing, their eyes bright with the particular intelligence of creatures that had learned to associate humans with grain. Finch scattered feed as she passed, watching them peck and scratch, and the simple normality of it, feeding chickens, walking to a field, starting a day, still amazed her sometimes. 3 months ago, she had been fighting for her life in the ruins of the junkyard. Now she was a farmer. The field spread across a gentle slope behind the farmhouse, terraced into beds that Helen had been building for 20 years. Each bed was a different crop, arranged according to a logic that Helen explained in fragments over the weeks: companion planting, crop rotation, the old knowledge that had been pushed aside by industrial agriculture and rediscovered by necessity when the supply chains collapsed. Tomatoes grew beside basil, beans climbed corn stalks. Marigolds bordered the beds like sentries, their bright faces turning toward the sun, their roots keeping the soil nematodes at bay. She learned to plant. Helen showed her how, the depth of the furrow, the spacing of the seeds, the gentle pressure of soil pressed over the top. "You're not burying them," Helen said. "You're tucking them in. There's a difference." Finch planted rows of beans and spinach and something called perpetual spinach that Helen said would keep producing through winter if you treated it right. She learned to weed, the slow, meditative work of pulling unwanted growth from around the bases of plants, working with her hands in the damp earth, feeling the roots give way beneath her fingers. She learned the names of vegetables she'd only ever seen in supermarkets: bok choy, silver beet, rocket, wambok. She learned the rhythm of the seasons in this part of the world, the way the rain came and went, the way the wind shifted, the way the soil felt different in your hands depending on what you were growing. Some soil was light and sandy, easy to work but poor in nutrients. Some was heavy and clay-like, stubborn and wet but rich. The best soil was dark and crumbly, the kind that smelled like life itself, and Helen's best beds had exactly that. She learned to mend fences. This was less poetic than planting. It involved wire cutters and pliers and a lot of swearing, but it was satisfying in its own way. There was something about fixing a thing that had been broken, about taking the damaged and making it whole again, that spoke to something deep in Finch's chest. She mended fences that had been broken by wind, by weather, by the occasional curious hollow that had wandered in from the bush and bumped against the wire until it gave. She mended them carefully, carefully, the way you'd mend a wound. She learned to milk a goat. This went badly. The goat, a large temperamental creature named Gerald that Helen swore was the most intelligent animal on the property, took one look at Finch and decided, with the absolute certainty that only goats possess, that she was not to be trusted. He kicked the bucket. He headbutted her shin. He made a sound that was somewhere between a bleat and a laugh, and Finch, sitting in the straw with milk on her jeans and indignation on her face, decided that Gerald was the worst animal she had ever met. "He likes you," Helen said, grinning. "That's not what that looked like." "That's exactly what that looked like. He doesn't kick the people he doesn't like. He just ignores them." "Gerald can go to hell." "Gerald's been to hell. That's why he's here." But Finch went back the next morning and the morning after that, and by the fourth day Gerald allowed her to sit beside him without kicking, and by the seventh he tolerated her hands on his udder with a resigned sigh that sounded almost philosophical. The milk was warm and faintly sweet, and Finch learned to do it without looking, the way Helen did, her hands working by feel alone, and the first time she filled a full bucket without incident she held it up like a trophy, and Gerald regarded her with an expression of profound indifference. She trained with Caleb. Every morning before the rest of the farm was awake they sparred in the barn. The barn was a large timber-framed structure with a dirt floor and a loft that was stacked with hay bales and smelled of dust and dry grass. Morning light came through the gaps between the planks in long, thin beams that caught the dust motes and turned them into slow, drifting galaxies. They worked in the center of the barn, between the empty stalls and the old plow that hung on the wall like a museum piece. Caleb was a different teacher than Mara, more patient, more encouraging, less inclined to hit first and explain later. He taught Finch the basics of knife fighting, the fundamentals of self-defense, the importance of always knowing where the exits were. "The knife is a tool," he said, turning the blade in the gray morning light that filtered through the barn doors. "It's not a weapon. The moment you think of it as a weapon, you start thinking of it as something aggressive, something offensive. But a knife is defensive. It's a last resort. It's the thing you reach for when everything else has failed." "And what's the first resort?" "Running. Always running. Running is the best fight you'll ever have because it's the only one where everyone survives." He taught her to read a room, to notice where the doors were, where the windows were, where the furniture was, where the threats were. He taught her to listen, not just with her ears but with her whole body, the way you learn to sense danger before you hear it, the way animals sense a storm before the first cloud appears. One morning Caleb set up a course in the barn using hay bales and wooden crates, arranging them into a maze of narrow passages and blind corners. "This is a room," he said. "A bad room. Someone's in it with you and they have a blade and they want to hurt you. find your way out. Finch moved through the course slowly, testing each corner before she rounded it, keeping her weight balanced, her knife low. Caleb appeared at random intervals, lunging from behind a crate, stepping into her path from a side passage, and she had to react, to deflect, to redirect. The first time he tagged her twice on the arm and once on the ribs. The second time she blocked both arm strikes but took the ribs again. The third time she got clean through without a touch, and Caleb nodded with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher whose student had finally understood the lesson. "You're getting better," he said one morning, after Finch had managed to disarm him for the first time. He rubbed his wrist where she'd twisted the knife free and looked at her with an expression that was part pride and part surprise. "I'm getting less terrible." That's the same thing in my experience. On Fridays, Caleb taught her tracking, reading the ground for signs of passage, identifying the prints of different animals, distinguishing between the marks left by hollows and those left by living people. Hollows dragged their feet. Their prints were long, smeared, uneven. Living people walked with purpose. Their prints were clean, spaced, deliberate. It was a quiet skill, this reading of the earth, and Finch found that she loved it, the way it forced her to slow down, to look closely, to notice the things that most people walked past. They talked about Earth One, about home, about June and Brookvale and the life they'd left behind. They talked about the device, the quantum device, the thing that had brought Caleb to Earth 2, the thing that had presumably brought Finch as well. They talked about whether it still existed, whether it could be found, whether it could be used to send them back. "If it does exist," Caleb said, "it's at the lab, the Quantum Lab's campus, which is somewhere in the Sydney Basin." So we'd have to go back to Sydney. We'd have to go back to Sydney. The idea was not appealing. Sydney was hollow central. It was where the outbreak had started, where the lab was, where the highest concentration of infected would be. Going back there was suicide, but the alternative was staying here forever, on a farm in a world that wasn't their own, and the thought of that, of never seeing Brookvale again, never seeing their house, never seeing June, was worse. "We'll figure it out," Caleb said. "We will." The evenings were the best part. After the work was done and the tools were put away and the animals were fed, the community gathered in the farmhouse kitchen for dinner. It was a large room, warm and bright, dominated by a long wooden table that Helen had built herself from salvaged timber. The table was scarred and stained and slightly uneven. One leg was a half-inch shorter than the others, which Helen had never bothered to fix, and it was the heart of the farm, the place where everything happened that mattered. They ate together, all of them, Helen, Caleb, Thomas, Lily, old Marcus, and whoever else happened to be passing through or sheltering for the night. The food was simple: roasted vegetables, fresh bread, soup made from whatever was in season, but it was hot and plentiful, and the act of eating together, of sitting around a table with other people and sharing a meal, was a ritual that Finch had not realized she was starving for until she experienced it again. In the junkyard, meals had been solitary, functional, eaten standing up or on the move. Here they lingered. They passed plates. They asked for seconds. They talked. Thomas was the quietest at the table, as he was quiet everywhere. He was perhaps 35, lean and precise, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, all angles and planes and careful edges. He had been a carpenter before the outbreak, and he still thought in terms of joints and angles and the structural integrity of things. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words had the quality of well-cut wood, clean, measured, fitted exactly to the space they occupied. He had a dry, understated humor that surfaced at unexpected moments, a deadpan observation delivered in the middle of someone else's sentence that could split the table open with laughter. "You're staring at the fence post again," he said to Finch one evening, not looking up from his bread. "I was thinking." "You were staring. There's a difference. Staring is what you do when you've forgotten to think. Thinking is what you do when you're trying to figure out why you're staring." Lily laughed. She always laughed at Thomas's humor, bright and unrestrained. the way Finch imagined she would have laughed at jokes in the old world. Lily was a year older than Finch, 17, with a tangle of dark hair that she wore in a braid that was perpetually coming undone, and a scar on her left knee from a fall she'd taken when she was 12. She had been on the farm since the outbreak, brought there by her parents who had died of the flu within the first year. Helen had raised her the way she raised everything, with stubbornness, with competence, with a minimum of sentiment and a maximum of expectation. Lily knew every inch of the property the way Finch knew every inch of her childhood bedroom. She knew which fence posts were loose, which beds needed watering, which of Gerald's moods were serious and which were performance. She was the farm's best shot with a rifle, which she had learned not because anyone taught her, but because she had decided at 14 that she was not going to be helpless. Lily and Finch had become friends with the ease of two people who discovered, to their mutual surprise, that they had things in common. Lily had read books, actual books, scavenged from abandoned houses, and she and Finch spent evenings on the porch, passing paperback novels back and forth, discussing them in the low conspiratorial tones of people who were discovering that the world still contained things worth talking about. Lily had never seen the ocean. Finch had never heard a possum scream at 3 a.m. These differences fascinated them both. Old Marcus sat at the end of the table as far from the door as possible, because old Marcus liked his back to the wall and his view unobstructed. He was perhaps 70, though it was hard to tell. His face was weathered and his hair was white, but his eyes were sharp and his hands, though gnarled with arthritis, were steady. He sat on the porch most days and whittled, small figures, mostly animals, carved from scraps of timber with a blade that he kept sharper than anything else on the farm. He gave the figures to the children, who collected them with a reverence that suggested they understood, even at their young ages, that they were holding something made by a man who remembered the world before. His stories were better than his carvings. He talked about the world before the outbreak, not with nostalgia, but with the clear-eyed precision of a man who had watched civilization end and wanted to make sure someone remembered what it had looked like. He told Finch about the time he'd driven from Sydney to Melbourne in a single day, eating meat pies at every service station, keeping score on a napkin. He told her about his wife, Margaret, who had died in 2018 and whom he still spoke of in the present tense. He told her about the day the outbreak hit, how he'd been in his garden, pruning roses, and he'd looked up and seen the smoke rising over the city, and he'd known with the certainty of a man who had survived a war that nothing was ever going to be the same. "The thing about the end of the world," Marcus said one evening, turning a half-finished wooden bird in his hands, "is that it doesn't look like the end. It looks like a Tuesday. It looks like someone pruning roses, and then it's not." She laughed sometimes. It surprised her every time, the sound of it, sudden and involuntary, rising from somewhere deep in her chest. She had forgotten that she could laugh. In the junkyard, laughter had been rare and precious, a commodity to be rationed. Here it came more easily, not freely. Nothing came freely in this world, but more easily. After dinner, they sat around the fire pit in the yard, the flames pushing back the dark, and they talked. Helen told stories about the farm in the early days, about the mistakes she'd made and the things she'd learned, about the first time she'd tried to build the water system and accidentally flooded the entire vegetable patch. Thomas talked about buildings he'd worked on before the outbreak, a library in Wollongong, a community center in Katoomba, a house in the Blue Mountains that had been designed by someone famous whose name he could never remember. Lily talked about the farm, about the changes she'd seen over 5 years, about the way the bush was slowly, patiently reclaiming the fences and the outbuildings and the roads. Marcus talked about everything and nothing, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried across the fire like a river carrying stones. These were the moments Finch treasured most. Not the work, not the training, not the quiet satisfaction of a fence repaired or a bed planted. These moments, people around a fire, talking and laughing, sharing the warmth of the flames and the warmth of each other. It was the thing she had lost when the policeman knocked on the door in Brookvale, not just her father, not just her mother, but the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. The sense that there were people in the world who knew her, who saw her, who would notice if she was gone. She slept through the night without dreaming. This surprised her most of all. For weeks, maybe months, she had dreamed about the tyrant, about the fight, about the knife, about the silver eyes going empty. But on the farm, in the clean sheets, with the sound of crickets outside the window and the distant creak of the barn in the wind, she slept deeply and dreamlessly, and she woke each morning feeling rested in a way she hadn't felt since before the highway. She thought about Mara, the real Mara, the Earth 2 Mara, the one who had died in the river. She thought about the cairn of stones and the cold water and the choice Mara had made, to stay under, to hold the door, to sacrifice herself so that Caleb and Finch could surface. She thought about the other Mara, the one who had saved a 6-year-old girl from a kitchen full of hollows, who had raised her and protected her, and then lost her to rage and loneliness and the terrible machinery of trauma. She thought about both Maras, and she wondered if somewhere in the vast, incomprehensible architecture of parallel universes there was a Mara who had survived. A Mara who had not drowned, who had not been lost, who was somewhere right now in some version of reality, alive. She hoped so. She hoped with a fierceness that surprised her. And sometimes in the quiet minutes before sleep took her, she thought about the life she was building here, the planting, the milking, the laughing, the sitting around fires with people who had become, without her quite noticing, something that resembled family. She thought about the fact that she was happy, and the happiness surprised her because happiness was a thing she had not expected to find in this world. She had expected to survive. She had expected to fight. She had not expected to plant beans and milk goats and sit on a porch with a girl named Lily and a wooden bird carved by an old man named Marcus, and feel for the first time in years that the ground beneath her feet was solid. But it was. The ground was solid. The days were quiet. And Finch Adderwood, who had been ripped from one world and dropped into another, who had fought hollows and tyrants and the worst version of herself, was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place worth staying in. Chapter 18. The Locked Door. It was a Tuesday when Finch found the door. She was exploring the farmhouse, a large old structure with more rooms than the farm currently used. Most of the doors were open. Some led to bedrooms, their walls bare, their floors swept clean. Some led to storage, stacked with preserves in jars, with tools and racks, with folded blankets and towels. One led to a root cellar that smelled like earth and potatoes and the faint sweet tang of fermenting apples. But one door at the end of a ground floor hallway was closed. Not just closed, locked. A heavy padlock secured a hasp that had been bolted to the frame with industrial-strength screws. The padlock was new, the brass gleaming against the weathered wood of the door. The screws were stainless steel, driven deep, the kind of hardware you bought when you wanted something to stay shut. Finch tried the handle, locked. She pressed her ear to the wood. Nothing, no sound from beyond. No breathing, no movement, no creak of floorboards. Just the wood, solid and silent and unyielding. She knocked, softly, a single rap, barely more than a tap. Hello? Silence, the kind of silence that presses back. She found Helen in the kitchen, kneading dough on the counter, her hands dusted with flour. That door at the end of the downstairs hall, Finch said. What's behind it? Helen's hands didn't stop moving. The dough rose and fell under her palms, steady and rhythmic. That door? It's locked. There's a padlock on it. Storage, Helen said. Supplies, medical stuff. Things we don't want everyone having access to. What's in there that needs a padlock that size? Helen looked up. Her expression was carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that meant she was hiding something. Not hiding it well, but hiding it deliberately, which was almost worse. Just storage, like I said. Don't worry about it. But Finch did worry about it. The locked door sat in her mind like a splinter, a small, persistent irritation that wouldn't go away. She tried to ignore it. She tried to focus on the farm, on the routine, on the quiet days. She tried to lose herself in the work, The planting, the weeding, the fence mending, the goat milking. Still badly, Gerald still laughing. But the door called to her, the way locked doors always call to curious people with the promise of something hidden. She thought about it at odd moments, while pulling weeds in the vegetable beds, while carrying water from the rainwater tank, while lying in bed at night listening to the crickets. A locked door in a house on a farm at the edge of the world. It was the kind of detail that novels were built around, the kind of thing that the protagonist was supposed to investigate, and Finch was self-aware enough to recognize the pattern but not self-disciplined enough to ignore it. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself Helen had said it was storage. She told herself that locked doors existed for reasons, and those reasons were usually good, and prying into them was not the behavior of someone who wanted to be trusted. But the door was there, and she was here. And the space between those two facts was where curiosity lived. She brought it up with Caleb casually, the way you bring up something you've been thinking about for days but don't want to seem like you've been thinking about for days. They were in the barn cleaning the knives after a training session, the blades gleaming in the slanted afternoon light. "Does Helen keep much in the way of locked storage?" Finch asked. Caleb looked at her. He had the kind of face that was hard to read, not because it was blank, but because it expressed things in micro-movements, a slight tightening of the jaw, a fractional narrowing of the eyes that you had to be paying close attention to catch. He was paying close attention now. "Some," he said. "Why?" "There's a locked room at the end of the downstairs hall. Padlocked, new hardware. Helen said it was medical supplies." "Then it's medical supplies." "Medical supplies don't need a padlock that size." Caleb set the knife down on the bench and looked at her properly. "Finch, whatever Helen says is behind that door is behind that door. She's earned her privacy. We all have." "I know, I just what?" Finch hesitated. She wanted to say that the door felt wrong, that the padlock felt wrong, that the careful neutrality on Helen's face felt wrong, but she didn't have the words for it, and even if she did, she wasn't sure she had the right. So she said what she always said when she was cornered by a question she didn't want to answer honestly. "Nothing. Forget it." Caleb studied her for another moment, then went back to his knife. He didn't say anything else, but Finch noticed later when she passed the locked door on her way to the kitchen that it was still there. Still locked, still silent, still keeping its secret with the patient. Implacable stillness of a thing that had no intention of explaining itself. 2 more days passed. Finch went about her work, the planting, the weeding, the training, the milking. She helped Helen hang laundry on the line strung between the porch and the barn, the sheets snapping in the wind like flags. She helped Thomas repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a storm, holding the posts steady while he drove them into the ground with a mallet that was almost too heavy for her to lift. She helped Lily inventory the seed stock, counting packets and recording them in a ledger that Lily kept with the meticulous precision of someone who understood that in a world without commerce, seeds were currency. But the door sat in her mind like a stone in a shoe, small, persistent, impossible to ignore. She caught herself glancing at it whenever she passed the hallway. She noticed the way Helen changed the subject when anyone mentioned the locked room. She noticed the way Thomas looked at the door sometimes, quickly, the way you look at a thing you know about but aren't supposed to acknowledge. 3 days after finding the door, she went back. The hallway was empty. The door was still locked. But Finch had been paying attention to the padlock, to the hasp, to the way the screws were set in the wood. She had watched Caleb pick locks in the junkyard. She had watched the tyrant Finch's people pick locks in the compound. She had watched enough to know the basics, and the basics, it turned out, were enough. She found a hairpin in her pocket. She'd been using them to keep her lavender hair out of her face, and she bent it into a shape that might have been a lockpick if you squinted and were generous with your definitions. She inserted it into the padlock, probed the mechanism, felt for the pins. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was slow. The technique Caleb had taught her played in her mind like a recipe. Feel for the first pin, apply gentle pressure, Lift until you feel it set, move to the next. The first pin resisted. She adjusted the angle, applied more pressure, felt it shift, a tiny click, barely audible, the sound of a spring compressing. The second pin was easier, already partially set, as though the lock had been opened and closed enough times to wear the mechanism smooth. The third pin fought her. She sweated, she adjusted, she breathed. She felt for the sweet spot, the point where the pin met the shear line, and she pushed gently, gently, the way Helen had taught her to press seeds into soil, and the pin lifted, and the lock turned, and the padlock fell open in her hand with a click that sounded, in the silence of the hallway, like a gunshot. The room beyond was dark. Finch pushed the door open and felt along the wall for a light switch. She found one, flipped it, and a bulb came on, dim, flickering, the kind of light that made shadows look alive. It was not a storage room, it was a bedroom. A small spare room with a single bed, a chair, and a window that had been painted over from the inside, the glass covered in a thick layer of white paint that let in no view and no light. The bed was occupied. Someone was lying in it beneath a thin blanket, and the someone was breathing, shallowly, but breathing. Finch stepped closer. The floorboards creaked under her weight. She froze. The breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, and the figure in the bed didn't stir. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else, the faint metallic scent of old blood, the kind that seeps into fabric and lingers. On the bedside table, a water glass sat half full, its rim clouded with dried droplets. A small pile of gauze wrappers lay beside it, evidence of bandages changed and discarded. The curtains, not that there were curtains because the window was painted shut, but there was a curtain rod above the window, empty, its hook swaying faintly in a draft that Finch couldn't feel. The person was a woman. She was thin, very thin, the kind of thin that comes from weeks of injury or illness, the kind that hollows out the cheeks and sharpens the collarbones and makes the hands look too large for the wrists. Her hair was dark, threaded with gray, and it lay across the pillow in a matted tangle. Her face was turned toward the wall, and Finch couldn't see it, but she could see the bandages on her arms, white gauze stained with old blood, and the IV drip that ran from a bag of fluid on a stand to a needle taped to the back of her hand. A vital signs monitor sat on the bedside table, its screen glowing green, its speaker emitting a soft, steady beep with each heartbeat. "Who are you?" Finch whispered. The woman stirred. Her eyes opened, slowly, painfully, the way eyes open when someone has been sleeping for a very long time and the light is unfamiliar and unwelcome. She blinked, once, twice. Her gaze moved from the wall to the ceiling to the figure standing at the bedside. She turned her head, and Finch saw her face. It was thinner than the last time Finch had seen it. There were new lines around the eyes, new shadows beneath the cheekbones, a pallor to the skin that spoke of blood loss and infection and the long, slow fight of a body trying to put itself back together. But the face was unmistakable, the sharp features, the dark hair threaded with gray, the watchful eyes that missed nothing, even now, even at the edge of consciousness. "Mara," Finch breathed. Mara looked at her. There was a long moment of silence, a silence that stretched and stretched, filled with the beeping of the monitor and the sound of Finch's heart hammering in her chest, and the wind outside the painted-over window. "Finch," Mara said. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, the voice of someone who had not used it in a long time. "You're here. You're alive." "Barely." Mara tried to sit up and failed. She lay back against the pillow, breathing hard, her thin hands clutching the blanket. "Barely alive." "How? We thought you were dead. In the river, the bridge. We thought—" "I know what you thought. I thought so too." Mara's eyes were heavy, struggling to stay open, the irises clouded with pain and exhaustion. I'll tell you everything. Just not now. I need to rest. Her eyes closed. The monitor beeped, the IV dripped. The woman who had sacrificed herself in the river lay in a bed in a room that was supposed to be a storage closet, and she was alive, and Finch Adderwood stood over her and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Finch sank into the chair beside the bed. Her legs had decided, independently of her brain, that they were no longer interested in supporting her weight. She sat and stared at the woman in the bed and tried to make her mind work properly. Mara was alive. Mara, who had drowned in the river, who had been buried under a cairn of stones, who had been mourned and grieved and mourned again. Mara, who had been the pillar that held up the world, and who had been taken from them, and who was now here in this room, breathing. The grief Finch had carried for Mara, the specific sharp-edged grief of losing someone who had been a teacher and a protector and a kind of mother, began to shift, to transform, to become something else. It didn't disappear. It couldn't. Because grief is not a thing that vanishes. It changed shape, the way water changes shape when it freezes, and what it became was something Finch hadn't felt in a long time, something she had forgotten the name of. Relief. She sat in the chair and felt the relief move through her like a tide, like the slow, warm current of a river carrying away the things that had accumulated on the bank. She pressed her hands to her face and breathed in and out, and she did not cry, though the crying was there, sitting behind her eyes like a crowd waiting for the doors to open. She looked around the room again now that the initial shock was fading and her eyes were adjusting to the dim light. The bed had been made with care, the sheets were clean, the blanket was pulled smooth, the pillow was fluffed. Someone had been tending to this room, to this woman, with a kind of quiet dedication that spoke of love or duty or both. A small shelf on the wall held a tin cup, a bar of soap, and a folded towel, the basics of hygiene, arranged with the precision of someone who understood that in a world without abundance, order was its own form of kindness. A water jug sat on the floor beside the bed, half full, its surface beaded with condensation. And on the windowsill, the painted-over lightless windowsill, someone had placed a single wildflower in a jam jar, its petals fading, its stem bent, but its color still bright against the white paint, a small act of defiance against the dimness and the isolation. Finch looked at the flower for a long time. Someone had brought a dying woman a flower. Someone had walked through the fields, picked a flower and carried it to a locked room in a farmhouse and placed it on the windowsill of a woman who might not have been alive to see it. It was the kind of gesture that meant nothing and everything at the same time, a declaration that beauty mattered, that hope was not foolish, that even in the darkest places there was room for something green and growing. Helen had done that. Finch knew it in her bones. Helen, with her flower-dusted hands and her carefully neutral expression and her "it's just storage," Helen had been keeping this secret, had been tending to Mara, had been carrying the weight of a living woman in a locked room and deciding, day by day, what to do with the knowledge. Finch felt a surge of something that was not quite anger and not quite admiration, but occupied the space between them. She would talk to Helen later. She would have questions. But right now, all that mattered was the steady beep of the monitor and the slow rise and fall of Mara's chest, and the flower on the windowsill. Finch sank into the chair beside the bed. Her legs had decided, independently of her brain, that they were no longer interested in supporting her weight. She sat and stared at the woman in the bed and tried to make her mind work properly. Mara was alive. Mara, who had drowned in the river, who had been buried under a cairn of stones, who had been mourned and grieved and mourned again. Mara, who had been the pillar that held up the world and who had been taken from them, and who was now here, in this room, breathing. The grief Finch had carried for Mara, the specific sharp-edged grief of losing someone who had been a teacher and a protector and a kind of mother, began to shift, to transform, to become something else. It didn't disappear. It couldn't, because grief is not a thing that vanishes. It changed shape, the way water changes shape when it freezes, and what it became was something Finch hadn't felt in a long time, something she had forgotten the name of. Relief. She sat in the chair and felt the relief move through her like a tide, like the slow, warm current of a river carrying away the things that had accumulated on the bank. She pressed her hands to her face and breathed in and out, and she did not cry, though the crying was there, sitting behind her eyes like a crowd waiting for the doors to open. She looked around the room again, now that the initial shock was fading and her eyes were adjusting to the dim light. The bed had been made with care, the sheets were clean, the blanket was pulled smooth, the pillow was fluffed. Someone had been tending to this room, to this woman, with the kind of quiet dedication that spoke of love or duty or both. A small shelf on the wall held a tin cup, a bar of soap, and a folded towel, the basics of hygiene, arranged with the precision of someone who understood that in a world without abundance, order was its own form of kindness. A water jug sat on the floor beside the bed, half full, its surface beaded with condensation. And on the windowsill, the painted-over lightless windowsill, someone had placed a single wildflower in a jam jar, its petals fading, its stem bent, but its color still bright against the white paint, a small act of defiance against the dimness and the isolation. Finch looked at the flower for a long time. Someone had brought a dying woman a flower. Someone had walked through the fields, picked a flower, and carried it to a locked room in a farmhouse and placed it on the windowsill of a woman who might not have been alive to see it. It was the kind of gesture that meant nothing and everything at the same time, a declaration that beauty mattered, that hope was not foolish, that even in the darkest places there was room for something green and growing. Helen had done that. Finch knew it in her bones. Helen, with her flour-dusted hands and her carefully neutral expression and her "it's just storage." Helen had been keeping this secret, had been tending to Mara, had been carrying the weight of a living woman in a locked room and deciding, day by day, what to do with the knowledge. Finch felt a surge of something that was not quite anger and not quite admiration, but occupied the space between them. She would talk to Helen later. She would have questions. But right now, all that mattered was the steady beep of the monitor and the slow rise and fall of Mara's chest and the flower on the windowsill. "Finch?" Caleb's voice from the hallway. "What are you doing? Helen said you went—" He stopped. He saw the room. He saw the bed. He saw the woman in it. His face went through a series of changes, confusion, recognition, disbelief, hope, and settled on something that looked impossibly like joy. "Oh my God," he said. "Yeah," Finch said. "I know." Chapter 19. Mara's Story. Mara recovered slowly. Over the next few weeks, she grew stronger. The color returned to her face in stages, first her cheeks, then her lips, then the skin around her eyes. She could sit up without assistance, then stand with a hand on the bedpost, then walk short distances around the room, leaning on the wall like a drunk leaning on a lamppost. Helen tended to her with the quiet competence of someone who had done this before, changed bandages, monitored the IV, checked vital signs with a stethoscope that was older than Finch. The first week, Mara slept more than she was awake. Her body demanded it with the brute authority of an organism that had been operating on fumes for weeks and was now being given the fuel to repair itself. She slept 12 hours, then 14, then a fitful 16, during which she muttered in her sleep, fragments of words, names that Finch couldn't catch, the occasional sharp intake of breath that sounded like drowning. Finch sat with her during the worst of it, holding her hand, feeling the fingers twitch and grasp, the way a sleeping child grasps for a parent. The second week, Mara began to eat. Helen brought her bowls of broth, bone broth made from the farm's scarce supply of meat, rich and golden with fragments of carrot and celery floating like tiny rafts. Mara sipped it slowly at first, her stomach rebelling against the richness after weeks of near starvation. But the body is a forgiving machine, and by the third day she was finishing entire bowls, and by the fifth she was asking for bread, and by the seventh she was sitting up in bed and eating a full meal of roasted vegetables and rice and looking at the empty plate with an expression that was half satisfaction and half disbelief, as though she had forgotten that food could be more than a theoretical concept. Helen changed the bandages on Mara's arms twice a day. The wounds were deep, not from the river, but from what had happened after the river, the details of which Mara had not yet shared. They were the kind of wounds that healed from the outside in, the skin closing slowly over damaged tissue, the scar tissue forming in ridges that would be there forever. Helen worked with careful hands, peeling away the old gauze, cleaning the wounds with a solution that smelled of iodine, applying fresh bandages with the practiced precision of someone who had stitched and bound and healed more bodies than she could count. "She's lucky to be alive," Helen told Finch one afternoon while Mara slept. When she arrived, Thomas brought her, the man who found her in the river. She was hypothermic, concussed, had 2 cracked ribs and a collapsed lung. I didn't think she'd make it through the first night. But she did. She did because she's Mara and Mara doesn't know how to die. Helen said it with a dryness that might have been humor or might have been reverence, and Finch couldn't tell which. She suspected it was both. Thomas visited every few days. He would appear in the doorway of Mara's room with his quiet, angular face and a bundle of something in his hands: firewood, fresh vegetables, a book he'd found in an abandoned house. He never stayed long. He would check on Mara, exchange a few words with Helen, and then leave, disappearing back into the rhythms of the farm with the silent efficiency of a man who was accustomed to occupying space without filling it. Finch noticed that he always looked at Mara when he thought no one was watching, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had carried something precious and heavy and was relieved, profoundly relieved, to find that the weight had been set down. When Mara was finally strong enough to talk, really talk, not the whispered fragments of the Discovery Day, but actual sentences, actual paragraphs, an actual story, she told them everything. It was evening. The fire in the farmhouse hearth was low and steady, casting amber light across the room. Mara sat in a chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of broth warming her hands. Caleb sat across from her, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. Finch sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her legs crossed. Helen stood by the door as though she might need to leave quickly if the story became too much. Thomas lingered in the hallway, half visible, listening. Mara began at the river. She had survived the river. Not easily and not without cost, but she had survived. When the bridge collapsed and the truck plunged into the water, she had been thrown free through the shattered windshield. The impact had driven the air from her lungs and the world from her mind, and she had been unconscious for an unknown period, seconds, maybe minutes, before the cold water dragged her back to awareness. She was underwater. The current was strong, the water black and full of debris, branches, rocks, pieces of the truck. She could feel them against her body, sharp edges tearing at her clothes and her skin, and the cold was everywhere, not just around her but inside her, filling her lungs, numbing her fingers, turning her blood to something slower and thicker than blood. She kicked toward the surface, fighting the current, fighting the weight of her waterlogged clothes, fighting the cold that was eating into her muscles like acid. She surfaced, gasping, choking, barely able to draw a breath before a wave broke over her head and pulled her under again. The river carried her downstream, not toward the bank where Caleb and Finch had crawled ashore, but in the opposite direction, around a bend in the river where the current was stronger and the banks were steeper. She fought it. She kicked toward the shore, using the last of her strength, and the river fought back, pushing her under, spinning her, slamming her against rocks that tore at her skin and her clothes and her will. She saw things in the water, a wheel from the truck spinning in the current like a broken compass, a shoe floating upright, still tied, a branch that she grabbed and held onto for 3 desperate seconds before the current ripped it from her hands. She thought she was going to die. She was certain of it. The certainty settled over her like the water itself, cold and heavy and absolute. She thought of the children at the junkyard, Reef, Spike, Bo, Wren, Cass, and she thought of the faces she had failed, the people she had not been able to save, and she thought, "This is what I deserve. This is the price." The body does not consult the mind about these things. The body acts on its own, driven by ancient imperatives that predate thought and fear and despair. Mara's legs kicked, Her arms reached, her lungs burned and screamed for air and found it. A pocket of it, trapped beneath an overhang of rock, enough to draw a breath that was half water and half air and entirely the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She found the shore eventually, not so much found as collapsed onto, a muddy bank hidden behind a stand of trees, invisible from the bridge above. She crawled out of the water on her hands and knees, coughing, bleeding, her body shaking so violently she could barely keep her hands flat on the mud. She lay there for a long time, face down in the dirt, breathing the cold air and feeling the cold ground and thinking, this is it. This is where it ends. But it wasn't. She lay there for hours. She lost track of time. The sky turned from gray to black, and the stars appeared, and the cold deepened, and Mara lay in the mud and shook and shook and shook. She was aware, distantly, that she was dying, not quickly, not dramatically, but the slow, quiet dying of a body that has been pushed past its limits and has no energy left to push back. The hypothermia was setting in. Her thoughts were becoming confused, disconnected, like radio stations fading in and out. She thought she heard voices. She thought she saw lights. She thought she was back at the junkyard, sitting by the fire. And then she thought she was underwater again. And then she thought nothing at all. A man had found her. Not a survivor from any group she knew. A stranger traveling alone along the riverbank, following the sound of the crash. He was perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with the careful movements of someone who had learned to be quiet in a world that punished noise. He had pulled her from the mud, carried her to shelter, a cabin hidden in the trees, its windows covered with blackout material, and tended to her injuries with the rough expertise of someone who had learned medicine out of necessity rather than choice. His name was Thomas, Mara said. She was sitting up in bed now, propped against pillows, a blanket over her legs. Her voice was stronger than it had been, but it still carried the rasp of someone whose throat had been raw for a long time. He used to work at quantum labs. The room went very still. Caleb leaned forward in his chair. Finch felt her heart rate quicken. Quantum labs, he repeated. Before the outbreak, he was a technician, not a scientist, not one of the important people. He ran maintenance on the equipment, the power systems, the cooling systems, the backup generators. He knew how things worked, even if he didn't always know why they worked. But he knew things. He knew what they were working on. He knew about the virus. He knew about the dimensional research. Dimensional research, Finch said. The word sat in the air like smoke. There was a second lab, Mara said. Not the one Caleb was held in. A different facility. Smaller, more secretive. It was located southwest of here, near the coast, hidden underground. It was focused entirely on dimensional travel, inter-universal transit, whatever you want to call it. They built a device, a machine that could open portals between parallel Earths. That's how I ended up here, Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. Yes. Thomas said the device was Quantum's greatest achievement and his greatest secret. He built it to prove that parallel worlds existed, and then he used it to bring people from those worlds, like you, Caleb, to Earth too, to exploit them for their biological advantages. It was never supposed to be used for that. It was supposed to be a scientific instrument, but Quantum saw an opportunity, and he took it. Mara paused. She lifted the cup of broth to her lips and drank, and Finch could see the effort it took, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her jaw worked as she swallowed, the brief closing of her eyes that said more than words about how close to the edge she had been. Thomas took care of me, she continued. For weeks. He had medical supplies, not much but enough. He cleaned my wounds, set my ribs, treated the lung with a technique he'd learned from a veterinarian's manual he'd found in a bookshop. He fed me what little he had. He talked to me when I was conscious enough to listen about the lab, about the device, about what Quantum had done. What did Quantum do? Caleb asked. He used the device to pull people from other Earths, people with specific biological traits, genetic advantages, things that could be harvested and studied. You were one of them, Caleb. He pulled you from Earth 1 because you had something he wanted, a genetic marker, a protein, something in your blood that he thought could be weaponized, and when he was done with you, he was going to send you back and pull someone else. It was a factory, a production line, and the device was the engine. Caleb's face was very still. Finch could see the muscles in his jaw working the way they did when he was holding something in. Anger, pain, the particular fury of a man who has just learned that his suffering was not random but designed. "And the device still exists?" Finch asked. "Thomas said it does. It's still at the second lab, which is—" Mara paused, as if gathering strength for what came next. "Which is not far from here." "Where?" "Southwest, about 100 kilometers, near the coast. Thomas told me about it before he left. He said the lab was still intact. Nobody had found it because nobody knew it was there. It was hidden, underground, with a concealed entrance. Thomas had been there once before the outbreak to service the backup generators. He knew the way." "And the device?" "It's there. Thomas said it was. He said it was in the main chamber in the center of the facility. A disc-like machine about 2 meters across. It needed power, a lot of power, but the facility had its own generator, a self-sustaining system, designed to run indefinitely without external input." Caleb and Finch looked at each other. The same thought was visible on both their faces. "Can it take us back?" Finch asked. "Thomas said it could take people between any 2 Earths. Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, whatever. The device doesn't care about the destination. It just needs coordinates, calibration." "Calibration that was apparently off enough to send Finch here by accident," Caleb said. Yes, Thomas said the device was old, built before the outbreak. It hadn't been maintained in years. The calibrations would be imprecise." "Great. So we might end up on Earth 4 or Earth 5 or some other version of reality that doesn't even have Australia." "Maybe. Or maybe it'll work perfectly. You won't know until you try." The room was silent. The fire crackled. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The wind outside rattled the painted-over window. Finch looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Mara. Mara looked at both of them with the expression of someone who had just handed them a map to buried treasure and was waiting to see if they'd dig. "You're sure about this?" Caleb asked Mara. "You trust Thomas?" "He saved my life. He could have left me in the mud. He could have taken my boots and my jacket and walked away. Instead, he carried me half a kilometer through the dark, set my ribs by lamplight, and fed me soup for 6 weeks." Mara's voice was quiet but firm, the voice of someone who had weighed a debt and found it heavy. "Yes, I trust him." "We'll go," Caleb said. "We'll go to the lab, we'll find the device, and we'll try." "And if it doesn't work," Finch asked, "then we'll figure something else out. We always do." They sat in silence for a long time after Mara finished speaking. The fire burned low, the embers settling into a bed of orange light that painted the walls in soft, shifting patterns. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat marking time in a room where time had suddenly become the most precious and precarious thing imaginable. Caleb was the first to speak. 100 kilometers, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Southwest, near the coast. That's what Thomas said. "And the device is underground, concealed entrance." "Yes." Caleb leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Finch could see him working through it. The logistics, the dangers, the distances. She recognized the expression because she had seen it on his face 100 times before, in 100 different situations, in this world and the other one. It was the face of a man who was building a plan, brick by brick, in the workshop of his mind. "I need to think about this," he said. There are a lot of variables, the hollows between here and there, the terrain, whether the lab is actually intact, whether the device actually works, whether we can actually power it." "We can," Mara said. "Thomas said the facility has its own generator, self-sustaining." Thomas said, "Thomas could be wrong. Thomas could be working from information that's years old." "Thomas could be, but he's the best lead we've got." Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at Finch, and the look was the look of a man who was asking a question without words. Are you with me? And Finch looked back, and the look she returned was the answer. I've always been with you. We'll need supplies, Caleb said. Food for at least a week, water, weapons, a vehicle, if we can find one that runs. I can help with the vehicle, Mara said. Thomas has a truck. He's been keeping it running. He's good with engines. He'd lend it to us. And the hollows? The route Thomas described avoids the worst of it. Southwest through the farmland, then coastal scrub. It's not populated enough for large numbers. Small groups, maybe. Scattered. Manageable. You've been planning this, Finch said. It wasn't a question. Mara's eyes met hers across the dim room. I've been planning this since the day Thomas told me about the lab. I've been lying in this bed, staring at that painted-over window, planning how to get the two of you home. The words landed in Finch's chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward through her body. She felt her eyes burn and blinked it away. Mara had been planning this. While she lay in the dark, while her body fought to heal, while the monitor beeped its steady count of her heartbeat, she had been planning their escape. She had been thinking about them, about Caleb and Finch, about the device and the lab and the long road southwest, and she had been doing it not for herself but for them, because that was what Mara did. That was what Mara had always done. She carried other people. Thank you, Finch said, and her voice came out rough, scraped raw by something she couldn't name. Mara looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, the mask of composure cracked, and Finch saw what was underneath. Not strength, not certainty, but love. The fierce, uncomplicated love of a woman who had found the people she was supposed to protect and was going to make damn sure they got home. Don't thank me yet, Mara said. Thank me when you're back in Brookvale eating your mother's cooking.